Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the second session of the fourth day of the joint symposium between the Heyman Centre and the Trinity College Hub, the Arts and Humanities Research Institute in Trinity College Dublin. My name is Jürgen Barkhoff. I'm Professor of German in Trinity College Dublin, and I'm with my colleagues. I'm absolutely delighted to be here to celebrate the budding relationship between the Heyman and the Hub, between Columbia and Trinity College, and sort of have this symposium. The panel this afternoon's session is on ethnicity, nationalism, and democratic futures. And on Tuesday in Dublin, we had a sort of parallel panel where we looked at the rise of the neo-right and the collapse of the center-left in Europe mainly, but we also were discussing Trumpism. In this, we discussed the sort of neo-populist, neo-nationalist and ethnicist movements and governments in Central Europe, the rise of neo-right parties in the German-speaking world. And it is great that we have a very distinguished panel of three sociologists this afternoon to look at this from the perspective, look at this in America and from the perspective of sociology. So I'll briefly introduce the three speakers. They will each speak for 20 minutes, then we have sort of the opportunity to respond to each other briefly, and then we'll open up to the floor for a more wide-ranging discussion. Our first speaker is Maria Abascal, Assistant Professor of Sociology here at Columbia. She recently completed her postdoc in Population Studies at the Training Center at Brown University, and her work has been on the impact of Hispanic population growth, real and perceived, on relations between blacks and whites in the United States. She also works on the sources of the criminal immigrant stereotype, the predictors of immigrant naturalization, and the geographic distribution of patriotic behaviors. Our second speaker is Professor Andreas Wimmer, Lieber Professor of Sociology and Political Philosophy here in Columbia, who has done long-term and global comparative studies on the questions of how states are built and nations formed, how individuals draw ethnic and racial boundaries between themselves and others, and which kinds of political conflicts and war result from these processes. His very influential and prize-winning books include Nationalist Exclusion and Ethnic Conflict, Shadows of Modernity, and Ethnic Boundary Making Institutions, Power and Networks, and Waves of War, Nationalism, State Foundation, and Ethnic Exclusion in the Modern World. And our third speaker is Bruce Western, Professor of Sociology at Harvard, but currently visiting professor here at Columbia. He has worked for many years on mass incarceration. His prize-winning and very influential book, Punishment and Inequality in America, will be known to many. He has worked in this field ever since. So we're very privileged to have, as I said, a most distinguished field of experts here. And Maria will kick off with Anxiety and Backlash to the Changing Face of America, brackets, and what we can do about it. And this, in brackets, this has been sort of a constant theme over these 4 days, because we're all very good at analyzing things, but the question of what we can do about it is, of course, also at the forefront of sort of a public engagement conference such as this. So, Maria, please go ahead.
So I'm going to start by reviewing some things that a lot of us are aware of, which is that the United States is becoming more diverse, and this process has been underway for some time now. So the most recent projections from the U.S. Census Bureau put whites as a minority of the U.S. population sometime in the 2040s or the 2050s. Every other major racial or ethnic groups, Latinos, blacks, and Asians, is expected to continue growing through a combination of immigration and high birth rates. In fact, today, particularly for Latinos, birth rates account for a lot of the story. So at last count, 13.4% of people living in the United States were born abroad. But immigration has been slowing since the year 2000, and especially since the recession. So In some cases, for example, in the case of immigration from Mexico, immigration has stalled and even reversed. So net migration from Mexico is currently negative. Donald Trump is trying to take credit for this. He's been citing lower apprehension figures at the U.S.-Mexico border in 2016 as evidence that his policies or his persona are already working, but in fact it's too early to tell, and we do know that decreasing migration from Mexico is certainly a trend that predates his election. One interesting aspect of recent migration to the United States is that it's shifted away from what are known as traditional gateways of migration. So even though immigrants today still tend to be concentrated in gateway states like California, Texas, Florida, New York, and New Jersey, the pattern of migration is shifting more towards locations in the Southeast and Midwest. And this is important because a lot of research on intergroup relations, particularly from social psychology, tells us that it's not just about the size of a minority group, it's actually about the growth, about demographic changes that can be particularly threatening, particularly for members of the dominant group. So if we look at growth in the migrant population in U.S. counties, here we have a measure that captures the size of the migrant population around the year 2012 relative to the size in 2000 for different counties in the United States. And we can get a sense of where migration, where the immigrant population was growing relative to the size that it was initially. And these are places, in many cases, that had small or very, historically recent migration flows, right? And these patterns are more diffuse, right? They're not concentrated in California and Texas. In fact, if there's any sort of pattern that we can discern, it's that counties in the Southeast and the Midwest are experiencing substantial diversification. In fact, the counties where the Latino population is growing the fastest in the United States today are North Dakota and North Carolina. So how do U.S.-born Americans view these changes? So these patterns have spawned a really interesting line of work on demographic changes, particularly in the U.S., and how both actual changes in people's communities and in the nation overall, as well as perceptions of those changes that might be a bit outdated, are associated with a number of outcomes. So some of the things that scholars have looked at are intergroup bias, racial identification, preferences for a range of different social policies, and then finally and relatedly, political ideology, partisanship, and vote choice, particularly in the most recent election. So I'm going to take each of these in turn. So the first question, which has to do with the relationship between demographic changes, both actual and perceived, and intergroup bias. So there is evidence that in response to demographic changes in the United States, whites express more fear, more anger toward ethnic minorities. They also express more sympathy toward other whites. Jennifer Richardson and Maureen Craig have worked extensively on the topic, and some of the things that they found is that when you make whites read about demographic changes affecting the country, for example, the fact that whites are going to be a minority by around 2042, or the fact that the Latino population is growing so rapidly, they are likely to say that they're not comfortable with their kids playing with children who are ethnic minorities. They're not comfortable with their relatives marrying ethnic minorities. They score higher on a test of implicit bias, specifically the implicit association test that's widely used in social psychology. And they express colder feelings toward every major racial and ethnic minority group, Latinos, Blacks, and Asians, which is particularly interesting because the story that they're made to read is specifically about the growth of the Latino population, and yet it seems to have these spillover effects for attitudes toward other groups. So the second major outcome that scholars have looked at is the question of racial and ethnic identification. This line of work really addresses a question that was posed very forcefully by Jennifer Lee and Frank Bean in a really agenda-setting review piece when they wrote, "The arrival of unprecedented numbers of Asians and Latinos complicates the black-white portrait of America. If a black-white color line no longer characterizes the nature of racial-ethnic relations in the United States, where will the new line be redrawn?" So my own work and some other work by Craig and Richardson shows that whites who are primed to think about demographic changes, identifying more strongly as white, Eric Knowles and Linda Trop, looking at real demographics in people's neighborhoods, have also found that Latino share and growth are associated with whites' identification with members of their own racial group. I think a particularly interesting set of findings comes from the work of Jacqueline Chen on priming threats to the racial status quo and finding that whites are more likely to enforce a black-white boundary, and the way that they proxy for that is by having them racially classify a set of ambiguous spaces, and they find that basically you have to clear a higher bar, so to speak, to be classified as white as opposed to black when the person who's classifying you is feeling threatened in other ways. So probably the most extensive line of work on recent demographic changes and reactions to them is about policy preferences, partisanship, and ideology. I'm going to summarize these very briefly because the findings really are sprawling. So researchers find that actual and perceived demographic changes are associated with more conservative policy opinions on a range of issues, from immigration policy kind of naturally to issues that reach beyond immigration policy, such as opposition to welfare, also support for the death penalty. In one, I think, particularly inventive field experiment, Ryan Enos at Harvard assigned Spanish speakers to ride trains with unsuspecting Boston commuters for 2 weeks, and then he gauged their support for restrictive immigration policies at the end of those 2 weeks, and he found that people who had ridden the train with people who spoke Spanish were more likely to oppose immigration to the United States. You know, there's higher support for the Tea Party, partisan identification leans right in places where the Latino population or the immigrant population is large or growing. So with that, let's think about, you know, what happens when you think about white people who feel a threat to their position, who identify strongly with their racial group, and who hold a number of conservative opinions that oppose government intervention on a range of things. And you basically have a portrait of Trump supporters. So it's not just that demographic changes are associated with levels of Trump support. Very interestingly, in an analysis that was done by Sean McKelvey and Jason McDaniel of the Cooperative Congressional Election Survey, which is one of the major surveys of people's political attitudes and vote choices, reported anxiety about diversity was actually a better predictor of Trump support than who you had supported in the prior two presidential elections. So these are not trivial effects. So related to this, in a separate line of work that I've done on county level support for Trump with Miguel Centeno at Princeton, one of the things that we found is that, you know, there's some narratives about the decline in manufacturing and income, you know, compressed income and income inequality being associated with Trump support. We don't find that counties that experienced a greater decline in manufacturing are, holding other things constant, more likely to go for Trump. We don't find the places where income is lower, holding other things constant, are more likely to vote for Trump. What we do find matters is the proportion of the population that is foreign-born in a county, and number two, the proportion of the population who in the last census in 2010 when they were asked about their family's ethnic origins or ancestry, answered American. So I want to end, briefly addressing the brackets that I included in my title by talking about the findings on minorities, right? Because a lot of the research that I've cited has looked at white Americans, or more specifically U.S.-born white Americans' responses to demographic change as real and perceived. There has been some work on how members of ethnic minorities, and particularly Black Americans, respond, and there is some evidence that when they are told to think about the growth of another group, there's also a conservative shift in their policy attitudes, and they also tend to align themselves in certain ways with whites' attitudes. However, what's kind of promising about the work on minorities is that it alludes to, it suggests maybe a way forward. So in another study by Maureen Craig and Jennifer Richardson, they find that making ethnic minorities think about discrimination that they've faced, so making Latinos and Asians think about discrimination that they've faced, leads them to identify more closely with Blacks, right? And these findings fit well within this model called the common in-group identity model, where really the way forward is to get people to expand their notion of what it means to be a member of the in-group, right? This is challenging to think about how we could apply these, same principles and insights to whites, because there was a recent report, I think it was 2 weeks ago on NPR, that 55% of white Americans believe that whites face discrimination in the United States today. I haven't looked at the data personally, but I suspect that the people, the whites who think that whites are facing discrimination, are not identifying more strongly with Blacks, as is the case with Latinos and Asians, right? So I'm going to wrap up with just a few takeaways. So there's evidence that anxieties about the growth of one group have spillover effects for attitudes toward other groups, right? And this is something that decades of research in social psychology didn't directly anticipate, right? And it's not just spillovers in terms of attitudes, in terms of bias, it's also spillovers in the sense that if the Latino population is growing, and that makes me more opposed to affirmative action, that's a policy that affects not just the Latinos who are causing me to be threatened, but other ethnic minorities in general. Next, not every group, and this is something I didn't touch on quite as explicitly, not every group growing prompts the same reaction. There's several studies that find when you get people to think about the Asian population growing, which is the fastest growing racial ethnic minority group in the United States today, that they don't have quite the same reaction as telling them that the Latino population is growing or that whites will be a minority in the near future. So in light of this, it's hard to make claims about the effects of diversity in general, right? Because the nature of that diversity matters. Not all diversity or diversification is created equal. And then finally, we need more research on a couple of things. One of them is how to address these anxieties, right? Particularly among whites, among members of the dominant group. So for them, thinking about commonalities with other groups might itself be a source of threat and not necessarily a way forward. And then what are the consequences of the reversal in immigration trends, particularly when people start to be aware of them? Is there going to be a plateau? Are we going to rewind in some way? These are all outstanding questions for future work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria.
You want to switch?
Our next speaker is Andreas Wimmer, and his topic is ethnic diversity, nationalism, and democracy.
Actually, while I'm looking for my slides here, I might warn you that the title has changed. I was thinking about doing something custom-made for today, but then I ended up not doing that. But it follows up very nicely on what Maria is talking about. So it's actually a much better paper intended to write, but I can't find it.
It was put on there.
Yeah,
It's so small here.
It's tiny.
It's.
Do you want?
Can I help?
Yeah, please. Can you read this? Without any glasses?
Now you're throwing down the challenge. Teshuva?
Yeah.
Teshuva.
Oh, yeah. And then it's the one that is called Columbia. This one right here. Wonderful. Thank you so much. Okay, so this is based on a co-author paper just appeared in the latest issue of Social Force, which is a kind of sociology journal. And it touches upon, as I just said, similar questions Maria has raised for the US. And, but we're looking at Europe as a whole, so we look at data from 33 countries across the continent, from Finland all the way down to Portugal, from Iceland all the way to Turkey, includes Russia, Ukraine, all Eastern Europe. And so I'm just open the discussion here with a couple of simple facts, mostly from political science research. So you have the rise of nationalist populism, not only in the US, but in many, many countries all over Europe. But one also has to say that some countries have not seen the rise of right-wing populist parties. Portugal, for example, doesn't have a single right-wing populist party. Spain doesn't have one either. A bunch of other countries are spared, if you want to use that kind of perspective of the phenomenon. Then we also know that anti-immigrant rhetoric is crucial for most of these populist right-wing parties. So it's a core element of the message, actually. So it's not a sideshow or something like that. We know that from the UK Independence Party, of course. We know it from the Front National in France. These are just the examples that I know that everybody here in the room knows about. That's why I'm putting them up here. Alternative für Deutschland, same thing. And of course, Trump's version of Republican rhetoric is also deeply anti-immigrant messages are a core part of it. We also know from political science research that anti-immigrant attitudes of individuals, of voters, is the best predictor, actually, of voting for these kind of parties. It's better than education, it's better than age, it's better than being male, it's better than being unemployed, all these kind of other things that usually count, that are good predictors of voting for these kind of parties. And yet, you know, anti-immigrant sentiment is not equally prominent in all these different countries. If you look at it from a comparative point of view, it's very low in Sweden, for example. It's very high in Greece, it's very high in Hungary, it's very high in Turkey. And so the question is why? Why are Swedes so much more open to welcome immigrants from faraway places than are Greeks or Hungarians? And we argue, and well, we like to believe that we show in this paper that it's not so much a matter of levels or types of immigration. It's not so much about how many immigrants you have. It's not so much how many immigrants from non-European, meaning non-white origins you have. It's not so much a matter of how many Muslim immigrants you have, as you might be tempted to think in the European context. It's also not about growth. It's not about how have stocks of immigrants increased, not how have stocks of non-white immigrants increased, how much have stocks of non-Muslim immigrants increased. So all of this doesn't really do all that much in explaining different levels of anti-immigrant sentiment across different European countries. Instead, we argue that macro-historical conditions, so we go back into history, that produce different forms of national identities are what matters most, what explains most of the differences in levels of anti-immigrant sentiment between countries. And these different forms of national identification make individuals, citizens, more or less open to include foreigners, immigrants, in the imagined community of the nation, to use the proverbial Benedict Anderson formula here. And these macro-historical conditions we show, that's kind of a sideline of our argument that we have some elements of empirical analysis to back it up. They also influence whether populist nationalism is prominent among the parties, the major parties. So these macro-historical conditions that we look at both explain anti-immigrant sentiment everywhere and the rise of these kind of parties, and such that populism doesn't, as a lot of political scientists seem to think, generate these anti-immigrant sentiments. There's not a causal relationship. That if you have these parties that rise for whatever reason, and people will start to become more anti-immigrant in their attitudes or sentiments. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about the existing research, and I can go through that very quickly because Maria has really prepared it really well. There's a lot of, it looks like individual kind of, tries to explain anti-immigrant sentiment on the basis of individual characteristics. So you have education, makes individuals more tolerant for whatever reason. Competition for jobs with immigrants, some people think, makes people less tolerant towards immigrants. Contact, a lot of social psychologists think that you just have to put people together and then they get, they become really friends with each other. And anti-immigrant sentiment, disappears. And other people, more political psychology researchers, have thought that if you are a right-winger or if you're a nationalist, then you will find foreigners problematic. It's kind of an individual level ideology argument. And then you have group level mechanisms. That's the kind of argument that Maria has put forward. So the group threat ideas is probably the most prominent of these arguments. So stocks or flows of immigrants, or of immigrants of different origins and so on and so on, are thought of being the most, well, it's the main drivers for anti-immigrant sentiments. If you have more immigrants, you have more anti-immigrants. If you have more certain kinds of immigrants, let's say Muslims or Latinos, you have more anti-immigrant sentiments. And then there's people who look at events. There's a paper by Joschka Legevi that shows, or tries to show, that if you have a terrorist attack, as you had in the Bali bombings when was that, a long time ago, then immigrants or anti-immigrant sentiment mushrooms as a result of that. So it's a more kind of eventful, historical view of what drives anti-immigrant sentiments. And then finally, you have kind of country level political variables. That's what political scientists like to do. So the argument that I've already mentioned is if you have right-wing parties, then people will become primed and so on. So they will think of immigrants in more terms. And a lot of people think that's with electoral systems. That's the bread and butter of political scientists. Proportional systems of election, small parties that become visible, and then the rhetorics kind of spill over into the mainstream, and people become anti-immigrant. And then you have people that have looked at the media, and they actually blame the media for scandalizing immigrants, having negative stories about immigrants, and then this kind of, again, influences how people think about immigration. And if the media, for whatever reason, turn negative on immigrants, then the population will follow like lemmings and kind of jump over the cliff into the abysm of right-wing politics. Okay, what's missing in this story, according to our view, is that even if you control for all these kinds of things, there's actually a large variation between countries in the average level of anti-immigrant sentiment that is left unexplained. And what we think, what we need to do is to bring in a long-term, more historically informed comparative perspective to account for these remaining very large, substantial differences in how open or closed towards immigration the citizens of different countries are. And what we do here in this paper is we focus on different trajectories of nation-state formation so that's basically 19th and 20th century, that produces different types and different intensities of national identities. And these then imply these different types and intensities of national identities, different boundary dynamics vis-a-vis immigrant others. It then becomes more or less difficult to perceive immigrants as part of the community of citizens or future citizens, and to see them as part actually of the we rather than endangering and threatening others. Okay, so here's in some detail. So we argue that this process of nation-state formation can be more or less traumatic from the point of view of a nationalist. And traumatic is loss of territory or loss of sovereignty through war or occupation. This doesn't make much sense for the US, although we can talk about the US later on. It does make sense for the US as well, but it's not less intuitive for you guys living here in the US than for most Europeans who have seen war, occupation, countries being divided, reunited, reshaped, and so on and so on over the last 200 years. And example is loss of territory. Hungary lost, what is it, 2/3 or 3/4 of its territory in the Treaty of Trianon in the 1924 or something like that. Loss of sovereignty, of course, you can think of the Baltic states, they were occupied, they were independent very briefly after World War I, and then were reoccupied, reconquered by Russia, and dominated by Russia until 1918. And then another element of this traumatic history is conflicts that threaten territory and or sovereignty, and these can be internal conflicts such as secessionist movements, think of contemporary Spain, think of Turkey, the Kurdish secessionist movement, and so on and so on and so on. Or they can be external through interstate conflict, irredentist, where one state claims the territory of a neighboring state, and so on. Think of the Turkey-Greece conflict, which is a very long and lasting history. Ukraine and Russia, just recently the Crimea thing, and so on. That's, of course, a more recent example. And traumatic histories of nation-state formation then translate into hostilities towards non-national others. And here in the next slide is the detailed arguments of how that happens. So we have these threat to sovereignty or territory by non-national others, by other countries, by domestic ethnic minorities, and so on. And then, if that happens, then the nation, rather than the state, becomes the focus of identification, because the state obviously hasn't been able to safeguard the interests of the nation in the view of the citizenry. So the focus of identification shifts towards the people, the nation as an imaginary community, away from the state. So then you have ethnic rather than civic nationalism, to use a kind of a well-established distinction. And then that makes acceptance or trust in non-national others more difficult, we argue. And then there's two processes here. One is path dependency. So even long after these traumatic histories have passed, these moments have passed, there's a routinization of these understanding of the self as being threatened by non-national others and so on, through history books, through collective memories, through kind of stories that grandmothers and grandfathers tell their children, and these kinds of things. And then there's a process of generalization. These negative attitudes are to become kind of detached towards the ethnic or national or country that proved to be or was perceived as being traumatic, and becomes generalized to all to all non-members of the nation. Okay, and then you end up with contemporary anti-immigrant sentiment. So that's the detailed mechanism, how it actually works, and what I'm going to show you is two steps of the analysis. First, I'm just connecting the blue stuff here. So I'm going to show you that if you had these threats to national sovereignty and or territory in the past, you have more anti-immigrant sentiment today. And then in the second step, I'm going to do the red stuff here. I'm going to show you how this works through intermediary steps. Okay. I don't know how much time do I actually have. I think I'm 20.
Go on.
Go on? How long?
Well, you've spoken for 15 minutes, so...
I spoke for 15
minutes. Yeah, but you have...
Okay, so let me do...
Go on. No, it's very interesting, and
but
you have another 10 minutes.
Bruce is going to be even more interesting, I promise.
No,
what you guys have to say.
You have another 10 minutes, Andreas.
No, okay, let me speed up the whole thing a little bit. So this is how we did it in terms of data. So we coded for each country whether there has been a loss of territory and independence or independence or none of that. And then there's, on the other dimension, there's loss of conflict as a pretty simple coding scheme, as you can imagine. And the darker shaded these fields, the more you have experienced these traumatic kind of things. In the upper left corner, you had a loss of territory and of independence since in the 19th, 20th century, and you had external and internal conflict. These should be countries whose populations today are obviously the most xenophobic, the most anti. And then we did this for 33 countries that have completed the European Social Survey. That's a kind of a standard survey that a lot of social scientists use. It's a high quality survey, so it's not like the world value surveys kind of thing. So it's it's done by, it's supervised by a Norwegian statistician, so it's actually pretty rigorous, meticulous, and sample frames and the whole thing. And then we integrated these country-level variables into a multi-level model that controls for a lot of other things. Basically for everything that the quantitative research thinks or has shown is relevant for explaining how anti or pro-immigrant individual actually feels. And this is the results here. The dependent variable here is response to the question, how many immigrants of different ethnicity/race should be admitted to the country. And these are countries that you can see here, so these are the 33 countries. And you can see a relatively straightforward association, which is a line between these geopolitical threat, levels of geopolitical threat at the bottom. The more threat, the more you have these traumatic events in the past history, and anti-immigrant attitudes on the y-axis. The higher up you are, the more you think no immigrants of different race and ethnicity than us should be admitted. And the results are actually similar if you look at another question. If you are more specifically asking about immigration of poor people from outside the European Union, so it's actually the same general pattern that you see here. And this, I showed you descriptive results, but if you do a real statistical analysis, controlling for all kinds of other things. Controlling means taking into account other kind of factors that influence reality, and here is what we did, taking into account gender, age, education, marriage, rural, urban residence, education of father, too much missing data for mothers, political attitudes, whether you're a right-winger or a liberal or a left-winger, religious attendance, how much you go to church or to a mosque in Turkey, occupational status, economic difficulties, how much you do, and so on and so on. A whole bunch of things. At the country level, you look at GDP growth, you look at immigration levels, you look at levels of specific groups of immigrants, as I mentioned before, so non-whites, people from Muslim countries. You look at change in these levels, because the threat argument actually is more appropriately measured with this change. We look at income inequality within these countries. We look at levels of globalization. These are all kinds of things that people have thought are important. This geopolitical threat variable that we focus on in this argument, in this article, explains more than all the other country level variables together. So it's something that is actually substantially powerful. It's not just that it's significant. Stars show up in your table or at the right place and that you're happy about it and so on. So it's actually really doing something. Okay, so let me talk about a little bit about robustness stuff. Maybe I don't do that. Maybe it's all, you can do all kinds of things with it. Well, maybe this is a nice graph, because the results that I showed you before are just for 1 year, the last year of the European Social Survey. The European Social Survey has been done every 2 years since 2012. And you can see here And one could argue that a constant, like this geopolitical threat in the past, cannot explain, ups and downs in anti-immigrant sentiment. All of a sudden, Swedes are no longer that pro-immigrant. They have elected the Swedish Democrat Party with 20%, which is an anti-immigrant, hardcore, right-wing nationalist party. But if you look at this data, at least, then there is not that much variation, actually, over time. Look at this. This is Hungary. It's one of the most consistently xenophobe countries in Europe. And look, it basically stays the same. And its relative position, relative to other countries, always stays the same. This is Sweden. They're always the nicest people. They always get on your nerves, the Swedes. They're always nice. And the relative position to other countries remains the same. So very few countries actually change their relative position in this overall rate of causal factors. Okay, the more robustness checks, let's just forget about that. Yeah. Oh, maybe I should mention the last one. So we don't think that it's actually driven by racist sentiment against non-white immigrants, that this is actually what we are picking up somehow. There's almost zero correlation. Well, it's not true. It's 0.09 between two questions. The one that we are asking, how many immigrants from different race ethnicity should be admitted to your country, and the question of how important is it that these immigrants are white. And so the two things seem to be quite unrelated from each other, which means that our respondents don't understand the different race ethnicity question mainly as a race question. That's what this means. Okay, now the red stuff, these mediating mechanisms that I talked about, very quickly. So here is the geopolitical threat. That's the variable that is a historical variable. And we use another data set here. Unfortunately, that's only for 18 countries to show that it's highly correlated with, that's a result of a multivariate regression, I'm only showing these kind of results, with ethnic nationalism, with emphasis on ancestry, on language competence, and so on, in defining the boundaries belonging to the nation. So you have, consistent with the argument, if you have these geopolitical threats in the past, then citizens of a country identify more with the nation defining these ethnic and ancestry terms than with the state, which would be civic nationalism. And this, in turn, is ethnic nationalism is highly associated with anti-immigrant attitudes. We also show then, now going back to the full set of 33 countries, that geopolitical threat also explains the salience of nationalism in party platforms. In other words, how prevalent nationalist, populist appeals are in the party platforms. That's a data set that political scientists have used. But that the salience of this party, of nationalism in party platform, is actually not associated significantly with anti-immigrant attitudes. In other words, it's not like some political scientists think that the rise of these parties is then generating anti-immigrant sentiment as a consequence of a shift in public discourse. But it is that both the rise of these nationalism in party politics, the rhetorics of parties, and anti-immigrant sentiment are the legacy of these of events in the past that have, that from a nationalist point of view, are traumatic. I think that's it. There's more. The generalization mechanism.
Oh, you need to come to a close.
Yeah. Okay. Conclusion. Conclusions are always boring because you just kind of repeat what you've already said, but okay. So it's worth to explore, we think, the historical roots of anti-immigrant sentiment from a comparative point of view. So to go deeper into history to explain the very sizable and consistent variation that we find between countries. Obviously, this kind of approach cannot explain the short-term fluctuations that you have in such sentiments. Some of it might be the result of the rise and fall of populist parties. Some of it might be the events, like the Paris terrorist attacks and so on. And immediately survey people after that. They will indeed say, yeah, events are terrible and so on. We should have much fewer of them. But then 2-3 months later, they might be back to the baseline level of anti-immigrant sentiment. So we cannot explain, these ups and downs here. But what we can explain is the bandwidth within which these ups and downs in different countries are moving. So we can explain the difference between the red and the blue country here, and not the ups and downs within these. And I was trying to have some political implications, because you have this in your title, Marianne, and I have to do something like that too. But unfortunately, history cannot be engineered backwards. So you cannot have Hungary have a less traumatic history than the state. You cannot make Hungary keep all these Eastern European domains. And most of the people who actually currently live in these domains would not want to be ruled by Hungarians again. So not that much can actually be done. If you look at this from the country level, contact, having people have contact with each other, won't undo what history has inscribed in people's consciousness, and has made them more or less receptive to the idea that other kinds of people could be part of the us, could become part of the community of citizens. Hostile media coverage, according to our analysis, might not actually be, might just be reflecting anti-immigrant sentiment that is widespread rather than actually generating it. Enlightened, intellectuals like us going out to the middle of the country and telling people that they should use other kind of categories, that they should think differently about the world, like some people at ASA seem to think, the American Sociological Association, like kind of things that we should get out there to the middle of the country and teach Trump supporters what they're wrong about and how they see the world. I don't think that this will work, and I think it's done.
Well, thank you very much. That was very fascinating. And we move on to Bruce Western, Race and Citizenship in the Era of Mass Incarceration.
Okay, well, my talk today is going to be a little bit different from the really wonderful presentations by Maria and Andreas, and I'm going to be talking about what I see as really new lines of racial exclusion, class exclusion in the United States that have emerged over the last 30 or 40 years in the context of quite fundamental changes in criminal justice policy. And so why would changes in crime policy be relevant to a discussion of ethnicity, nationalism, and democratic futures? And so what I want to argue to you in my 15 or 20 minutes is that what we've seen with this change in crime policy in the United States is the emergence of a new kind of racial and economic disadvantage that really amounts to a contraction of American citizenship. And in this sense, I think my topic today is very continuous with the themes that Maria and Andreas were sounding. And when I say that crime policy has produced a a contraction of citizenship in America. I mean that citizenship has changed in T.H. Marshall's sense, that social membership has become more narrow. There are a smaller number of people who enjoy full membership in American society as a result of changes in crime policy. And I also mean that citizenship has changed in a classical liberal sense, that for a significantly large group of people in the United States, their relationship to the state has been quite fundamentally altered. And the conceptual starting point for this discussion is the idea of mass incarceration. And this was a term that was originally coined by the sociologist David Garland, writing in the early 2000s. David Garland said that mass incarceration really consisted of two things. First, it was a rate of imprisonment, a rate of incarceration that was significantly higher than historically had been the case, and it was comparatively unusual. So a very extreme rate of incarceration, a very extreme rate of penal confinement in the country. But then he went on and said there was a second part of this definition of mass incarceration, and the second part was that incarceration is so socially concentrated that we're no longer incarcerating the individual, but we're incarcerating whole groups. And for me as a sociologist, this was an utterly intriguing idea. At what point do we go from incarcerating the individual to incarcerating the group? And so in a lot of the work that I've done, I'm trying to come up with empirical markers for this idea that we're incarcerating the group. And the research I'm going to talk about will describe this. And I think as I end up, I think we probably need to reformulate a little bit Garland's idea of mass incarceration, particularly if we're interested in this proposition that the change in crime policy has resulted in a contraction in American citizenship, and as a result, a deterioration in the quality of American democracy as well. Okay, so let me start with some empirical context. I'm suspecting statistics on the size of prison and jail populations in the United States may not be familiar to everyone in the room. So let me give you some data to motivate this discussion. So we measure the incarceration rate in a country. We measure the scale of the penal system in a country with an incarceration rate. And this is the number of people who are locked up in prison or jail on any given day per 100,000 of the population, typically. And in Western Europe, incarceration rates were around about 100 per 100,000. And so 0.1 of 1% of the population on any given day were behind bars in Western Europe. And then we compare the United States. And the incarceration rate in the United States is about 700 per 100,000, about 0.7 of 1% of the US population on any given day is behind bars. And so, you know, this speaks to Garland's idea that the level of incarceration in the United States is comparatively very, very unusual. And we can think about how unusual the American system of incarceration is also in historical terms. And we have quite good data that go back to the 1920s, and we have data on imprisonment rates. And if we look at imprisonment rates from, say, the mid-1920s to the early 1970s, the imprisonment rate was about 100 per 100,000, exactly the same as what we see in Western Europe today. But in the early 1970s, the system began to change. It began to grow, and it grew every year for the next 35 years. So we're now sitting at the top of this plateau in which the imprisonment rate in the United States is about 5 times its historic average, and the United States is the world's leader in imprisonment. The United States accounts for 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's penal population. And this is new. It's historically new. It's only emerged in the last decade or so. What does this mean in terms of numbers? It means that there are about 1.6 million people who are currently incarcerated serving time in state or federal prison. This is the deep end of the criminal justice system. So this is people who have been convicted of a felony. That's the most serious category of offences. They're serving about 28 months in a state or federal institution at the median. Some are serving very much longer. In the United States right now, we have about 50,000 people who are serving life without parole sentences. That means they are never getting out. In Western Europe right now, the number of people serving life without parole sentences is 12. And so people serve very long sentences in the United States. So not only is the incarceration rate higher, but the periods of incarceration are very much longer. So 1.6 million people in state or federal prison. That's not the whole penal population in the United States, because there are another 730,000 people who are in local jails, locked up in local jails. And these are mostly people who are awaiting trial or serving short sentences, typically less than 12 months. Now, this isn't the whole population under correctional supervision, because there are people who are out in the community reporting each week or each month to a parole officer. So there are 850,000 people who are on parole in the United States. In addition, there's another 4 million people on probation. So these are people who are serving suspended sentences, non-custodial sentences, and reporting to a probation officer each month. You add it all up, and about 7 million people are currently under correctional supervision in the United States. This is historically novel. It's only emerged in the last 20 years or so. Now, as striking as these statistics are, this is not what is most important about the penal system in the United States. The most important thing about the penal system in the United States is its unequal distribution across the population. And in some work with Becky Pettit, a demographer at the University of Texas at Austin, we were trying to calculate different kinds of disparities in incarceration, different kinds of inequalities in incarceration. And everything I've shown you so far is a snapshot at a point in time. How many people are locked up on a given day? But we could think about a different kind of statistic, right? The cumulative risk of imprisonment. What's the likelihood that someone is going to serve time in prison at some point in their lives? And why might we be interested in a statistic like that? Well, we might think that serving time in prison affects a whole array of life chances even after you come out. And I think this is where the penal system becomes important as a source of social exclusion in American society. So, Becky and I looked at a birth cohort of people born in the late 1940s. And this is a group of people who were reaching their mid-30s in 1979, before the real explosion in prison populations in the United States. And we're asking, well, what's the likelihood that people in this birth cohort are ever going to serve time in prison? Because the deep end of the system now, felony conviction, 28 months of time served at the median. So the first thing to note from this figure is that there is a large racial disparity in incarceration. And African Americans are about 5 to 6 times more likely to go to prison than whites. Very large racial disparity. If we think about the Latino population, Latinos are about twice as likely to go to prison as whites. And if we look at this graph, we can also see that there's a large disparity by levels of schooling. And we can think of this, or I think of this, as a class disparity. And if we think about non-college African American men, that's about the bottom half of the educational distribution of African American men in this birth cohort. 1 in 8 will go to prison at some point in their lives if they were born in the late 1940s. So we compared this group to a group of people born in the late 1970s, and they're reaching their mid-30s around 2010 or so. So they're growing up through the American prison. But if we look at their lifetime risks of imprisonment, for African American men who never went to college, and this is about half of all African American men in this birth cohort, more than a third will serve time in prison at some point in their lives. If they dropped out of high school, and this is the very bottom of the education distribution, about the bottom 10% of the population, prison time has become a normal life event, and about 70% of those men will go to prison at some point in their lives. So for me as a sociologist, the question is, what's the significance of this? What's the significance of this for social and economic inequality in American society? And I want to argue to you that the emergence of mass incarceration, comparatively and historically unusual rates of incarceration that are very, very socially concentrated in a small segment of the population, so that the experience of going to prison has become normative for certain demographic groups. I want to argue that this has had very enduring effects on patterns of social and economic inequality. And the inequalities created by this pattern of incarceration are particularly deep and enduring, I'm going to argue, because they are invisible, cumulative, and intergenerational. Invisible, cumulative, and intergenerational. I want to do quick work on each of these ideas. Invisible inequality, what does that mean? The inequality created by incarceration is invisible because incarceration is very socially concentrated. So although America is the largest jailer in the world, this is unknown to the vast mainstream of American society, and the criminal justice footprint has fallen very, very heavily on a small number of highly disadvantaged communities. The institutions themselves are segregated. Often prisons are in very far-flung places, a long way from the communities that supply most of the population. So they're sort of hidden from mainstream understanding in many ways. They're distant from the experience of the American white middle class, but well known to low-income communities of colour in which incarceration rates are highest. It's important for sociology, I think, because inequality, particularly our assessments of economic well-being in the population, tend to underestimate how bad things are going in communities with very high rates of institutionalisation, because those are highly institutionalised populations, in many ways quite hidden from our means of social accounting. Very simple illustration of this idea. We measure the employment rate in the society with an employment to population ratio. If we look at black men under age 35, if they dropped out of high school, we can measure it with the current population survey. There's the big labour force survey that's used by the Department of Labour to measure the monthly unemployment rate in the country. We can see that the employment to population ratio has dropped from over 60% to around 40% for African American men never finished high school under age 35. Now this wildly overestimates how well these men are doing in terms of their employment. Why? Because this group of people has very high rates of institutionalisation, and those people in prison and jail aren't captured by the labour force survey used to measure employment in the labour market. So what if we simply counted people in prison or jail as part of the population as we estimate the employment to population ratio. And the true employment to population ratio looks like this. The entire difference between these two series is due to the size of the penal population. The true employment rate for African American men in this age group at this level of schooling is around 25%. And in fact, their incarceration rate is over 30%, so they're much more likely to be in prison or jail than in a job in the open labour market. So that's invisible inequality. Next idea is cumulative inequality. What happens to people after they come out of prison? What happens to people after they come out of prison? What their economic prospects look like? There's a lot of research on this topic. Survey estimates show that employment and earnings is reduced by about 40% as a consequence of serving time in prison. There's good experimental evidence that shows that employers are incredibly reluctant to take on people with criminal records, and having a criminal record reduces employment by a third to a half. I can't give a talk like this without showing you some of the people that I've been talking to about these sorts of issues, and I want to show you a videotape of a man I was interviewing. And I hope this works. As part of a project we have called the Boston Reentry Study. This is a man called Peter. Peter's in his late 40s, spent most of his adult life in prison in Massachusetts, and I'm talking to him here probably about a year after his release from prison, and he's talking about employment.
Took care of their families because of me, but I was doing it the wrong way. Or going to work every day and seeing how everybody was gravitating to me, I realized that I was the energy, I was that magnetic force. And the same feeling that I was getting from me living that illegal life, how people was depending on me, I was getting the same feeling going to work every day, and now I'm saying I'm doing the right thing. I'm doing it the right way. So it felt good going to work and me speaking to people and giving them encouragement when they come to work and they ain't having a good day or things is going on in their life, and I can give them some advice, I can tell them something to help them get through the day that made me feel good, or I can teach them something. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. And I know that they depend on me. When I left that program, they missed me. And my boss told me he still email me and call me now, like, a lot of guys, they're always asking about you. How are you doing? So it's good to leave that effect on people when I leave. And I know that they get a lot from me. And I get something from that too. That's my gift that I give to people, and like I said, I get rewarded for that. Yeah, I get rewarded for that. I get a good feeling. That helps me. That's my therapy. Yeah.
So I find Peter's discussion really important and interesting here, particularly as we consider Maria's question of how do we make change? What changes should we be thinking about? If we think that mass incarceration has created a new form of social exclusion in the United States, the employment of people who are at risk of very high rates of incarceration, I think is a fundamentally socially integrative step, right? And not only is it reducing economic inequality in readily measurable ways. But Peter's telling us it's giving him a source of pride and meaning in his own life, and it has a social effect on others in his peer network and his community, and so I think retreating from mass incarceration will necessarily involve inflating the economic opportunities of people who are negatively affected. Okay, so that's cumulative inequality. Last thing, intergenerational inequality. So lots of people in prison means lots of kids with incarcerated parents. And there's a burgeoning research literature now which shows that parental incarceration has all sorts of negative effects on children. They tend to do poorly at school. There's evidence of depressive symptoms, externalizing behaviour, acting out, increased risk of homelessness among children, poor health, and losses in family income. All I want to say about this is just show you one more time series to give you a sense of the magnitude of the problem. So there are now about 600,000 Latino kids who have a parent that's currently incarcerated. There are about 750,000 white kids who have an incarcerated parent right now, and there's about 1.2 million African American kids with an incarcerated parent. That's about 1 in 9 of all black children have an incarcerated parent right now. And if we think about the cumulative risk of parental incarceration for children, kids right now, about a quarter of all African American children will experience the imprisonment of their father by age 14. So the inequality created by mass incarceration, I think, is very enduring because it is invisible, cumulative, and intergenerational. I want to show one last video, and then I will conclude. And I want to show Peter again. And he's talking about change in his life, and he's talking about his son.
To New York, my youngest son to New York to get him a suit to go to his brother's funeral. And my mother called me because she had found out what happened. And I cried all the way to New York. My son was in the back seat sleeping. I could see that he was going through it mentally. He was going through it mentally. And I told my mama, I said, Mom, if I change my life, will you take care of us? And she was like, who? And I was like, God, if I change my life, is he take care of us? And she was like, yeah. She said, yeah, just trust and believe, he'll take care of you. So I made a decision to change my life. He was taking care of us. Yeah. He was taking care of us. Yeah.
So, I think, for me, this is sort of the great paradox of mass incarceration. It says something about its ethical status as a political project. And, in the criminal justice system, we often measure the success of the system in terms of the way that it can reduce recidivism or divert people from crime. And I think often what it's doing is that it asks from people really extraordinary acts of personal agency and personal change in their lives. And it's asking that of people who in many cases Their agency is profoundly compromised by things like untreated mental illness and drug addiction and homelessness. And this is the great ethical paradox, I think. And so, in this area, if we're going to retreat from this historically novel form of racial exclusion, I think we need to think about alternatives that are fundamentally socially integrative, that draw people into the social compact, that address things like employment and health and housing and people's sense of social security in general. And I think the key move to get beyond this ethical paradox will be to do so in a non-blaming way. The criminal justice system fundamentally is a blaming institution. And in order to make a qualitative break with this policy regime, we need to think of policy alternatives. And we know what they are. And they're drug treatment, mental health treatment, employment, education and housing. We need to think about delivering those in a way that isn't tied to a criminal justice disposition, that is fundamentally socially integrative. And I think that would be a just alternative to the type of social exclusion that's emerged under mass incarceration.
Thank you very much to our three speakers for three very interesting, very important takes on citizenship, ethnicity, and race. I think I'll open up to the floor immediately so that we have time for discussion with the audience.
This question is directed to Abascal. You mentioned, you talked a bit about white or Caucasian reaction to non-white immigration or non-Caucasian immigration, and also a bit about African American reaction to that. But I'm kind of interested, do you have any insights or figures on Caucasian immigrant reaction to non-Caucasian immigrant immigration?
I don't, and I actually don't know that.
I'm speaking here of, for example, someone who's immigrated here from Eastern Europe and who is reacting in one way or another to the immigration from Mexico or somewhere else. You should study me.
Yeah, so Andreas is my first observation versus I'm actually not aware of any studies that look at that specifically. Part of it is just a question of small numbers, right? And so when you have a 2,000-person survey, how many immigrants are you going to have who identify as white? Not many, but that's no excuse, and there's certainly ways, with interviews and other methods to get at that question.
Okay. I think the first question came from you. Yeah.
I have a question for Abascal, and thanks for a very stimulating presentation. And at the beginning of your presentation, you said that the talk will be about the relationship between racial attitudes toward immigrants and the demographic changes, right? Real and perceived of immigrants. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about the distinction between the real demographic changes and perceived demographic changes. First of all, is that distinction really important? And then, secondly, how distant are the real changes and perceived changes? You said that Carolina and Dakota are the two places that are experiencing the rapid demographic changes. And how are people, Americans, feeling about this change? Like, are they feeling that their place, cities, towns, neighborhoods are now overwhelmingly kind of dominated by foreigners, whereas in fact immigration was really tiny, statistically speaking, proportionally speaking, right? So I wonder this distinction between these two.
Yeah, so the distinction between the two is not just that there is a gap, right, but that gap is, there's a gap between what people perceive and what's actually going on, right? But also that gap is associated with attitudes. Like, the bigger the gap between what's actually happening, the growth that's actually taking place in your community and what you think is actually going on, the more hostile your attitudes toward immigrants. This is work that has been done by another sociologist. In addition, people are, as some sociologists call them, demographically innumerate. They don't have a very good sense of, how big certain groups are in the places where they live, but they're better at assessing, they have a better intuition for changes that are going on, and they're better at intuiting changes at a more local level. This is why I think the findings are a little bit more consistent when you actually manipulate people's perceptions of demographic changes, when you actually just give them accurate information about demographic changes, than when you look at what are actual demographic changes in their states, for example.
Okay, over here.
Thank you. I have two quick questions, one for Maria and one for Andreas. For Maria, I'm curious about the contact theory that seems to be refuted by some of the findings that you've shown, where generally the assumption is if we meet people, then we gain greater understanding for them and their group. And in the case of homophobia, we've seen that seems to work, right? So if people are more exposed to people who are out, especially in the families and the communities, they're more likely to support same-marriage equality. What is different between the two, you think? Would you hypothesize? Is it that racism is somehow deeper seated than homophobia? Is it because it has more of a historical legacy in the country? What could be reasons why they're so different? And then for Andreas, I'm curious if you've looked at the data by regions within countries, if that's possible or not, and if you've seen similar patterns. So I'm thinking of, for example, the southernmost region in the Netherlands, Limburg, which is very supportive of Geert Wilders and the right Communist Party, and always went back between development and the Netherlands, for example, or Eastern Germany, that was between East and West. So you can see differences there. Thank you.
So the contact hypothesis, which comes out of work in the 50s and 60s from social psychologists, which is, in very simple terms, this idea that having contact with members of certain outgroups is going to erase your prejudice because it's going to make you aware that, they're unfounded, right? That you had certain assumptions and that they're inaccurate. But even social psychologists today wouldn't subscribe to that kind of simplistic interpretation of the contact hypothesis. A lot of research shows that contact is a robust way to reduce prejudice when it happens under certain very circumscribed conditions, like equal status within the interaction, like cooperative interaction, and things like that. So I imagine that may be the root of the difference.
And just a little addendum to what Maria just said. These conditions in real life are so rare. And basically you could say it's not one of the major elements of what you see out there in the real world. So I can't make this work.
The answer is very short. We didn't do that. Great idea. Thanks. You're next.
Yes, I have a question for Professor Wimmer. I think I probably misunderstood what you said about this, but I guess you were saying that your research shows that racial attitudes are actually play a relatively minor role in anti-immigration feeling, and it's really kind of the threat to the state, or a perceived threat to the state that does. And there was something that you said, I can't quote you directly, but made me think that when you made the claim that racism did not have any really much to do with this, that you basically kind of asked people whether it did or not, and they said it didn't, and then you accepted it. And I'm sure I'm misconstruing what you said, because that obviously would not be kind of methodologically a good way of approaching it. But I'm wondering how you actually did establish that racism and racial attitudes did not affect people's view on this issue.
Yeah, you did indeed misconstrue what I said, but I also brushed over this very, very quickly, I must say. So the question that we looked at is the question, how much immigration should there be, according to your opinion, from people of different ethnic/racial background? And so our whole analysis is based on answers to this question. So what then emerges as an issue is, how did individuals actually understand this question, right? Did they focus on the ethnic part, or did they focus on the racial part? And in very concrete terms, this could mean very different things. You know? It could mean, for a German respondent, if he or she understood the question as referring to ethnicity, it would basically mean all non-Germans. How many non-Germans should be admitted to the country? That would include French, it would include British, it would include Finns, it would include and so on. If they understood the question as racial, then most likely they would only refer this to immigrants from the developing world, from Africa, from Asia, from India, maybe from Latin America, and so on. So the question is, how do they actually understand this question? In our argument, according to our argument, they understood it, or did I say something wrong? Being shut down by them. In our understanding, this anti-immigrant sentiment is generalized, as we argue, across to basically all non-national others. So for British, the Polish plumber, the famed one, is as problematic, although he's clearly white, like the plumber from Nigeria. There might be gradations of differentiation, but overall, it's good enough that the plumber is non-British to stimulate some kind of hostile reactions from the native British population. Okay, so how can we be sure about this? So there's another question in the survey that asks, well, how important is it for you that immigrants be white? So you ask the racial question unequivocally, right? And so the responses to that white immigration question and the responses to the different race ethnicity question are basically almost not correlated with each other, which means that when people are asked about immigrants from different race ethnicity, they're not primarily thinking of this as people from different racial origins. Otherwise, the two questions will be highly correlated. Otherwise, people who say, we don't want any people of different race ethnicity, they would also respond, we don't want any people of non-white background.
But my question was why you accept the answer to the second question as being accurate or true.
We have a lot of other questions.
You mean social desirability bias? People who reveal what they really think on the second question.
Yes.
Yeah, that's possible.
Okay.
It's a question for Bruce. I was interested that you chose 1979 as your that was kind of pivot year. Things get significantly, the criminal justice gets significantly punitive after that. And 1979 is also the year of neoliberalism in the Anglo-American world. At least, it's the year of the election of Margaret Thatcher. Ronald Reagan comes a year after. Political organisation changes. Are these two facts connected?
Yeah, it's a great question. I didn't speak at all to the causal origins of the prison boom, but I think criminal justice policy and social policy are changing in tandem at this same time. And it probably starts a little bit earlier. We already see policy changes on both fronts in the 1970s, but things really gather momentum through the 80s, and and 90s, and the welfare state is withdrawing from the lives of low-income people. Certainly in the United States, a discourse of personal responsibility flourishes even more than it had hit historically, and political and policy talk about poor communities becomes morally inflected to a new degree, I would say, and I think changes in criminal justice policy and social policy are very much related, and so we also see, I think, new kinds of socioeconomic disadvantage emerging in this changing social policy environment. So really serious employment problems among low-skilled men. And if they're dealing with other problems, like mental illness or drug addiction, in the United States, there is no social policy response to that problem, particularly if they're living independently of families. And then the criminal justice system in this context becomes the social policy of last resort for a very, very deeply disadvantaged group that has really emerged under a neoliberal policy regime. So I think I agree very much with that analysis.
Do you think it also started Bill, it's linked also to, they moved into free markets too, and I wonder about the rise of private prisons.
Yeah, but
I had two questions. One, for Professor Wimmer, in his last question about ethnicity race.
Can you speak up a little bit?
Yes, I have two questions. One for Professor Wimmer and one for Professor Lester. Both of which pick up on questions that have already been asked. So my question about the ethnicity race issue is just a conceptual question. Because if I understood you correctly, you're conceptualizing ethnicity as determined in part by descent, not simply as cultural, right? Not simply as and if that's the case, then it looks like ethnicity is arguably something like a racial category if descent is determined. So it looks like we're having that the real distinction you're drawing is a distinction between say narrowly drawn racial categories and more broadly drawn racial categories. So that, in other words, the point would be the distinction between German and Pole in this view looks like a racial distinction since it's determined by descent, which is, has to do with origin, but a narrowly drawn racial distinction, whereas the distinction between black and white is like a broadly drawn racial distinction. And put this, of course, in a larger, historical perspective, then it becomes, it's important to see then that racial differences have to be understood, what large has to be understood, not only with reference between Europe and the non-European world, but also in terms of intra-European distinctions. I'm just going on, there's a long history of that. So that's the conceptual point. My question for Professor Western has to do with the causal story. And I guess the question is, how useful, I heard some echoes of some of what we processed about these things in your answers to the last question, the demise of the welfare state, the contraction of the welfare state, the expansion of the state, that sort of thing. In that connection, I was kind of wondering how useful, and this goes to the issue of how you're thinking about citizenship, how useful is it to think about the incarceration crisis, first of all, in terms of something like the notion of a ghetto carceral, and second, how useful is it to think about the incarceration crisis in terms of the notion of racial domination, which again is because if you think in terms of racial domination, then it looks like it looks to me like the concept of racial domination gives you a distinct perspective on the issue of citizenship, right? So that we're no longer talking about exclusion or loss of social membership in a martial sense, but we're talking about a kind of degradation of citizenship as a function of domination.
Okay, thank you. Who wants to go first?
Do you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's a lot of insight in this idea that many large socio-political changes in America can be thought of as successively different institutionalized forms of racial domination. I think there's a lot of insight in that idea. For me, mass incarceration is a somewhat complicated case because I think it is very intimately connected to the conditions of American poverty as well as race. And so nearly all of the growth in the American penal system since 1980 was concentrated among the non-college fraction of the population. So college-educated African Americans didn't experience any increase at all in their incarceration rates, while mass incarceration was flourishing, and meanwhile incarceration rates exploded among poor African Americans, and also incarceration rates increased quite dramatically among poor whites as well. So for me, I think there's very much a story about race and poverty. This idea of this degraded citizenship, I like that. I think, and because, and I think part of what's going on sort of falls outside of how Marshall thought about citizenship and how we commonly think about citizenship in this context. And the key difference is that lines of social exclusion are being raised in a very direct way through the coercive agency of the state. And it's state violence that is creating social exclusion. And if anyone is in any doubt about the violent character, the fundamentally violent character of incarceration, they need to visit a state prison and to see how order is maintained in a facility like that. And I think that is different. And you know, that's a massive deployment of state violence internally, with the outcome of creating very deep social inequalities, second-class citizenship, and so on. I do think we need a different kind of language to talk about the social membership, the subjugated kind of social membership that emerges under those conditions. So I like that idea.
Yeah, there's some interesting, complicated conceptual but also empirical issues that you're raising here. Well, in this conversation, there's the kind of gap in understanding of these matters between people from the Anglo-Saxon world, especially the US, and then people outside of that domain. So from an American point of view, everything that is exclusionary and that implies group hierarchies and so on has to have to do with race. And so then observers start to call everything race that looks like that. But from a more abstract conceptual point of view, it is very thinkable that you have stark hierarchies, forms of exclusion and so on. They are based on ethnic kind of distinctions, where phenotype, different bodies and so on, are not conceived as being part of the differences, but the differences conceived with different ancestry, different language, different culture. So you have all the Balkan wars and so on, where people have done terrible things to each other, hierarchy between Serbs on one hand and Kosovo Albanians on the other, that it looks like the American South in the 1920s or something like that. You can have that with people who look the same, you can have that between people who don't think of each other as different, constituting different races. So there's nothing, one doesn't make these forms of exclusion, let's say the anti-Polish plumber discourse among the UK Independence Party, any more civil if one says that it's not based on racial distinction. So I would submit that the distinction between ethnic and racial forms of differentiation should be maintained. We cannot just collapse everything under race. That is kind of ancestry-based.
Just one quick thought. I'm not necessarily pushing that, but the category of descent is historically, even in the United States,
that has both, you know, both ethnicity and race have the category, have the idea of descent in it. But then there's different markers of differentiation, you know, phenotypes and bodies on the one hand, and this cultural stuff.
Thank you very much. I know there are more questions, but we have run out of time. We're actually over time. Now we started a little bit late, so that's perhaps forgivable. But as we have another section coming, first of all, I would like to thank our great speakers, but also our great audience for a very good question and a very good discussion.